Hello, this is the next part of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Tanglewood Tales, the second part of the first story, The Minotaur. One morning when Prince Theseus awoke, he fancied that he must have had a very sorrowful dream, and that it was still running in his mind, even now that his eyes were open. For it appeared as if the air was full of a melancholy wail, and when he listened more attentively, he could hear sobs and groans and screams of woe, mingled with deep, quiet sighs, which came from the king's palace, and from the streets, and from the temples, and from every habitation in the city. And all these mournful noises, issuing out of thousands of separate hearts, united themselves into the one great sound of affliction which had startled Theseus from slumber. He put on his clothes as quickly as he could, not forgetting his sandals and gold-hilted sword, and hastening to the king inquired what it all meant. "Alas, my son," quoth King Aegeus, heaving a long sigh, "here is a very lamentable matter in hand. This is the woefullest anniversary in the whole year. 'Tis the day when we annually draw lots to see which of the youths and maidens of Athens shall go to be devoured by the horrible Minotaur." "The Minotaur!" exclaimed Prince Theseus, and like a brave young prince as he was, he put his hand to the hilt of his sword. "What kind of a monster may that be? Is it not possible at the risk of one's life to slay him?" But King Aegeus shook his venerable head, and to convince Theseus that it was quite a hopeless case, he gave him an explanation of the whole affair. It seems that in the island of Crete there lived a certain dreadful monster called a Minotaur, which was shaped partly like a man and partly like a bull, and was altogether such a hideous sort of creature that it is really disagreeable to think of him. If he were suffered to exist at all, it should have been on some desert island or in the duskiness of some deep cavern where nobody would ever be tormented by his abominable appearance. But King Minos, who reigned over Crete, laid out a vast deal of money in building a habitation for the Minotaur, and took great care of his health and comfort, merely for mischief's sake. A few years before this time there had been a war between the city of Athens and the island of Crete, in which the Athenians were beaten and compelled to beg for peace. No peace could they obtain, however, except on condition that they should send 7 young men and 7 maidens every year to be devoured by the pet monster of the cruel King Minos. For 3 years past this grievous calamity had been borne, and the sobs and groans and shrieks with which the city was now filled were caused by the people's woe, because the fatal day had come again, when the 14 victims were to be chosen by lot, and the old people feared lest their sons or daughters might be taken, and the youths and damsels dreaded lest they themselves might be destined to glut the ravenous maw of that detestable man brute. But when Theseus heard the story, he straightened himself up so that he seemed taller than ever before, and as for his face, it was indignant, despiteful, bold, tender, and compassionate, all in one look. "Let the people of Athens this year draw lots for only 6 young men instead of 7, said he. "I will be the 7th myself, and let the Minotaur devour me if he can." "Oh, my dear son," cried King Aegeus, "why would you expose yourself to this horrible fate? You are a royal prince and have a right to hold yourself above the destinies of common men." "'Tis because I am a prince, your son, and the rightful heir of your kingdom, that I freely take upon me the calamity of your subjects," answered Theseus. "And you, my father, being king over this people and answerable to heaven for their welfare, are bound to sacrifice what is dearest to you, rather than that the son or daughter of the poorest citizen should come to any harm." The old king shed tears, and besought Theseus not to leave him desolate in his old age, more especially as he had just begun to know the happiness of possessing a good and valiant son. Theseus, however, felt that he was in the right, and therefore would not give up his resolution. But he assured his father that he did not intend to be eaten up unresistingly like a sheep, and that if the Minotaur devoured him, it should not be without a battle for his dinner. And finally, since he could not help it, King Aegeus consented to let him go. So a vessel was got ready, and rigged with black sails, and Theseus with 6 other young men and 7 tender and beautiful damsels came down to the harbour to embark. A sorrowful multitude accompanied them to the shore. There was the poor old king too, leaning on his son's arm and looking as if his single heart held all the grief of Athens. Just as Prince Theseus was going on board, his father bethought himself of one last word to say. "My beloved son," said he, grasping the prince's hand, "you observe that the sails of this vessel are black, as indeed they ought to be, since it goes on a voyage of sorrow and despair. Now, being weighed down with infirmities, I know not whether I can survive till the vessel shall return. But, as long as I do live, I shall creep daily to the top of yonder cliff to watch if there be a sail upon the sea. And, dearest Theseus, if by some happy chance you should escape the jaws of the Minotaur, then tear down those dismal sails, and hoist others that shall be bright as the sunshine. Beholding them on the horizon myself, and all the people will know that you are coming back victorious, and will welcome you with such a festal uproar as Athens never heard before." Theseus promised that he would do so. Then, going on board, the mariners trimmed the vessel's black sails to the wind, which blew faintly off the shore, being pretty much made up of the sighs of everybody kept pouring forth on this melancholy occasion. But, by and by, when they got fairly out to sea, there came a stiff breeze from the northwest, and drove them along as merrily over the white-capped waves as if they had been going on the most delightful errand imaginable. And though it was a sad business enough, I rather question whether 14 young people, without any old persons to keep them in order, could continue to spend the whole time of the voyage in being miserable. There had been some few dances upon the undulating deck, I suspect, and some hearty bursts of laughter and other such unseasonable merriment among the victims, before the high blue mountains of Crete began to show themselves among the far-off clouds. That sight, to be sure, made them all very grave again. Theseus stood among the sailors, gazing eagerly towards the land, although as yet it seemed hardly more substantial than the clouds amidst which the mountains were looming up. Once or twice he fancied that he saw a glare of some bright object a long way off, flinging a gleam across the waves. "Did you see that flash of light?" he inquired of the master of the vessel. "No, Prince, but I have seen it before," answered the master. "It came from Talus, I suppose." As the breeze came fresher just then, the master was busy with trimming his sails, and had no more time to answer questions, but while the vessel flew faster and faster towards Crete, Theseus was astonished to behold a human figure, gigantic in size, which appeared to be striding with a measured movement along the margin of the island. It stepped from cliff to cliff, and sometimes from one headland to another, while the sea foamed and thundered on the shore beneath, and dashed its jets of spray over the giant's feet. What was still more remarkable, whenever the sun shone on this huge figure, it flickered and glimmered. Its vast countenance, too, had a metallic lustre, and threw great flashes of splendour through the air. The folds of its garments, moreover, instead of waving in the wind, fell heavily over its limbs, as if woven of some kind of metal. The nigher the vessel came, the more Theseus wondered what this immense giant could be, and whether it actually had life or no. For though it walked and made other lifelike motions, There yet was a kind of jerk in its gait, which, together with its brazen aspect, caused the young prince to suspect that it was no true giant, but only a wonderful piece of machinery. The figure looked all the more terrible because it carried an enormous brass club on its shoulder. "What is this wonder?" Theseus asked of the master of the vessel, who was now at leisure to answer him. "It is Talus, the man of brass," said the master. And is he a live giant or a brazen image?" asked Theseus. "That truly," replied the master, "is the point which has always perplexed me. Some say, indeed, that this Talus was hammered out for King Minos by Vulcan himself, the skilfullest of all workers in metal. But who ever saw a brazen image that had sense enough to walk round an island 3 times a day, as this giant walks around the island of Crete, challenging every vessel that comes nigh the shore? He is a puzzler, take him how you will." Still, the vessel went bounding onwards, and now Theseus could hear the brazen clangor of the giant's footsteps as he trod heavily upon the sea-beaten rocks, some of which were seen to crack and crumble into the foamy waves beneath his weight. As they approached the entrance of the port, the giant straddled clear across it, with a foot firmly planted on each headland, and uplifting his club to such a height that its butt end was hidden in a cloud, he stood in that formidable posture with the sun gleaming all over his metal surface. There seemed nothing else to be expected but that the next moment he would fetch his great club down, slam, bang, and smash the vessel into 1,000 pieces, without heeding how many innocent people he might destroy. There is seldom any mercy in a giant, and quite as little in a piece of brass clockwork. But just when Theseus and his companions thought the blow was coming, the brazen lips unclosed themselves and the figure spoke. "Whence come you, strangers?" And when the ringing voice ceased, there was just such a reverberation as you may have heard within a great church bell for a moment or two after the stroke of the hammer. "From Athens," shouted the master in reply. "On what errand?" thundered the man of brass. And he whirled the club aloft more threateningly than ever, as if he were about to smite them with a thunderstroke right amidships, because Athens, so little while ago, had been at war with Crete. "We bring the 7 youths and the 7 maidens," answered the master, "to be devoured by the Minotaur." "Pass!" cried the brazen giant. That one loud word rolled all about the sky, while again there was a booming reverberation within the figure's breast. The vessel glided between the headlands of the port, and the giant resumed his march. In a few moments this wondrous sentinel was far away, flashing in the distant sunshine, and revolving with immense strides around the island of Crete, as it was his never-ceasing task to do. No sooner had they entered the harbour than a party of the guards of King Minos came down to the waterside and took charge of the 14 young men and damsels. Surrounded by these armed warriors, Prince Theseus and his companions were led to the king's palace and ushered into his presence. Now, Minos was a stern and pitiless king. He bent his shaggy brows upon the poor Athenian victims. Any other mortal beholding their fresh and tender beauty and their innocent looks would have felt himself sitting on thorns until he had made every soul of them happy by bidding them to go free as the summer wind. But this immitigable Minos cared only to examine whether they were plump enough to satisfy the Minotaur's appetite. For my part, I wish he himself had been the only victim, and the monster would have found him a pretty tough one. One after another, King Minos called these pale, frightened youths and sobbing maidens to his footstool, gave them each a poke in the ribs with his sceptre to try whether they were in good flesh or no, and dismissed them with a nod to his guards. But when his eyes rested on Theseus, the king looked at him more attentively, because his face was calm and brave. "Young man," asked he with his stern voice.
"Are you not appalled at the certainty of being devoured by this terrible Minotaur?"
"I have offered my life in a good cause," answered Theseus, "and therefore I give it freely and gladly. But thou, King Minos, art a more hideous monster than the Minotaur himself."
"Aha! Do you think me so?" cried the king, laughing in his cruel way. "Tomorrow at breakfast time you shall have an opportunity of judging which is the greater monster, the Minotaur or the king. Take them away, guards, and let this free-spoken youth be the Minotaur's first morsel."
Near the king's throne, though I had no time to tell you so before, stood his daughter, Ariadne. She was a beautiful and tender-hearted maiden, and looked at these poor doomed captives with very different feelings from those of the iron-breasted King Minos. And when she beheld the brave-spirited figure of Prince Theseus bearing himself so calmly in his terrible peril, she grew 100 times more pitiful than before. As the guards were taking him away, she flung herself at the king's feet and besought him to set all the captives free, and especially this one young man.
"Peace, foolish girl," answered King Minos. "What hast thou to do with an affair like this? It is a matter of state policy, and therefore quite beyond thy weak comprehension. Go, water thy flowers, and think no more of these Athenian caitiffs, whom the Minotaur shall as certainly eat up for breakfast as I will eat a partridge for my supper."
So saying, the king looked cruel enough to devour Theseus and all the rest of the captives himself. Had there been no Minotaur to save him the trouble, as he would hear not another word in their favour, the prisoners were now led away and clapped into a dungeon where the jailer advised them to go to sleep as soon as possible, because the Minotaur was in the habit of calling for breakfast early. The 7 maidens and 6 of the young men soon sobbed themselves to slumber. But Theseus kept himself awake and paced to and fro across the gloomy dungeon in which they were shut up. Just before midnight the door was softly unbarred, and the gentle Ariadne showed herself with a torch in her hand.
"Are you awake, Prince Theseus?"
she whispered. "Yes," answered Theseus. "With so little time to live, I do not choose to waste any of it in sleep."
"Then follow me," said Ariadne, "and tread softly."
What had become of the jailer and the guards, Theseus never knew. But however that might be, Ariadne opened all the doors and led him forth from the darksome prison into the pleasant moonlight.
"Theseus," said the maiden, "you can now get on board your vessel and sail away for Athens."
"No," answered the young man, "I will never leave Crete unless I can first slay the Minotaur and save my poor companions, and deliver Athens from this cruel tribute."
"I knew that this would be your resolution," said Ariadne. "Come then with me, brave Theseus. Here is your own sword which the guards deprived you of. You will need it, and pray heaven that you may use it well."
Then she led Theseus along by the hand until they came to a dark, shadowy grove, where the moonlight wasted itself on the tops of the trees, without shedding hardly so much as a glimmering beam upon their pathway. After going a good way through this obscurity, they reached a high marble wall, which was overgrown with creeping plants that made it shaggy with their verdure. The wall seemed to have no door on any window or any windows, but rose up lofty and massive and mysterious, and was neither to be clambered over nor, so far as Theseus could perceive, to be passed through. Nevertheless, Ariadne did but press one of her soft little fingers against a particular block of marble, and though it looked as solid as any other part of the wall, it yielded to her touch, disclosing an entrance just wide enough to admit them. They crept through, and the marble stone swung back into place. "We are now said Ariadne. "In the famous labyrinth which Daedalus built before he made himself a pair of wings and flew away from our island like a bird. That Daedalus was a very cunning workman, but for all his artful contrivances, this labyrinth is the most wonderful. Were we to take but a few steps from the doorway, we might wander about all our lifetime and never find it again. Yet in the very centre of this labyrinth is the Minotaur, and Theseus, you must go thither to seek him." "But how shall I ever find him?" asked Theseus, "if the labyrinth so bewilders me as you say it will?" Just as he spoke, they heard a rough and very disagreeable roar, which greatly resembled the lowing of a fierce bull, but yet had some sort of sound like the human voice. Theseus even fancied a rude articulation in it, as if the creature that uttered it were trying to shape his hoarse breath into words. "That is the Minotaur's noise," whispered Ariadne, closely grasping the hand of Theseus and pressing one of her own hands to her heart, which was all in a tremble. "You must follow that sound through the windings of the labyrinth, and by you will find him. Stay, take the end of this silken string, I will hold the other end, and then if you win the victory, it will lead you again to this spot. Farewell, brave Theseus." So the young man took the end of the silken string in his left hand, and his gold-hilted sword ready drawn from its scabbard in the other, and trod boldly into the inscrutable labyrinth. Theseus had not taken 5 steps before he lost sight of Ariadne, and in 5 more his head was growing dizzy. But still he went on, now creeping through a low arch, now ascending a flight of steps, now in one crooked passage, now in another, with here a door opening before him and there one banging behind, until it really seemed as if the walls spun round and whirled him round along with them. And as he passed onwards, the clouds gathered over the moon, and the labyrinth grew so dusky that Theseus could no longer discern the bewilderment through which he was passing. He would have felt quite lost and utterly hopeless of ever again walking in the straight path, if every little while he had not been conscious of a gentle twitch at the silken cord. Then he knew that the tender-hearted Ariadne was still holding the other end, and that she was fearing for him and hoping for him and giving him just as much of her sympathy as if she were close by his side. But still he followed the dreadful roar of the Minotaur, which now grew louder and louder, and finally so very loud that Theseus fully expected to come close upon him at every new zigzag and wriggle of the path. And at last, in an open space at the very centre of the labyrinth, he did discern the hideous creature. Sure enough, what an ugly monster it was! Only his horned head belonged to a bull, and yet somehow or other he looked like a bull all over, preposterously waddling on his hind legs, or, if you happen to view him in another way, he seemed wholly a man, and all the more monstrous for being so. Theseus hated him and shuddered at him, and yet could not but be sensible of some sort of pity, and all the more the uglier and more detestable the creature was. Was Theseus afraid? By no means, my dear auditors. What a hero like Theseus afraid? Not had the Minotaur had 20 bull heads instead of 1. Bald as he was, however, I rather fancy that it strengthened his valiant heart just at this crisis to feel a tremulous twitch at the silken cord which he was still holding in his left hand. It was as if Ariadne were giving him all her might and courage. Much as he already had, and little as she had to give, it made his own seem twice as much. And to confess the honest truth, he needed the whole, for now the Minotaur, turning suddenly about, caught sight of Theseus, and instantly lowered his horribly sharp horns exactly as a mad bull does when he means to rush against an enemy. At the same time he belched forth the tremendous roar, in which there was something like the words of human language, but all disjointed and shaken to pieces by passing through the gullet of a miserably enraged brute. Theseus could only guess what the creature intended to say, and that rather by his gestures than his words. For the Minotaur's horns were sharper than his wits, and of a great deal more service to him than his tongue. But probably this was the sense of what he uttered.
Wretch of a human being, I'll stick my horns through you and toss you 50 feet high and eat you up the moment you come down.
"Come on then and try it," was all that Theseus deigned to reply, for he was far too magnanimous to assault his enemy with insolent language. Without more words on either side, there ensued the most awful fight between Theseus and the Minotaur that ever happened beneath the sun or moon. I really know not how it might have turned out if the monster, in his first headlong rush against Theseus, had not missed him by a hair's breadth and broken one of his horns short off against the stone wall. On this mishap he bellowed so intolerably that a part of the labyrinth tumbled down, and all the inhabitants of Crete mistook the noise for an uncommonly heavy thunderstorm. Smarting with the pain, he galloped around the open space in so ridiculous a way that Theseus laughed at it long afterwards, though not precisely at that moment. After this, the two antagonists stood valiantly up to one another and fought sword to horn for a long while. At last the Minotaur made a run at Theseus, grazed his left side with his horn and flung him down. And thinking that he had stabbed him to the heart, he cut a great caper in the air, opening his bull mouth from ear to ear and preparing to snap his head off. But Theseus by this time had leapt up and caught the monster off his guard. Fetching a sword stroke at him with all his force, he hit him fair upon the neck and made his bull head skip 6 yards from his human body, which fell down flat upon the ground. So now the battle was ended. Immediately the moon shone out as brightly as if all the troubles of the world and all the wickedness and the ugliness that infests human life were past and gone for ever. And Theseus, as he leaned on his sword-taking breath, felt another twitch of the silken cord, for all through the terrible encounter he had held it fast in his left hand. Eager to let Ariadne know of his success, he followed the guidance of the thread and soon found himself at the entrance of the labyrinth. "Thou hast slain the monster!" cried Ariadne, clasping her hands. "Thanks to thee, dear Ariadne," answered Theseus. "I return victorious." "Then," said Ariadne, "we must quickly summon thy friends and get them and thyself on board the vessel before dawn. If morning finds thee here, my father will avenge the Minotaur." To make my story short, the poor captives were awakened and, hardly knowing whether it was not a joyful dream, were told of what Theseus had done, and that they must set sail for Athens before daybreak. Hastening down to the vessel, they all clambered on board except Prince Theseus, who lingered behind them on the strand, holding Ariadne's hand clasped in his own. "Dear maiden," he said, "thou wilt surely go with us. Thou art too gentle and sweet a child for such an iron-hearted father as King Minos. Come with us, then, for he will be very angry when he knows what thou hast done." "No, Theseus," the maiden said, pressing his hand and then drawing back a step or two. "I cannot go with you. My father is old and has nobody but myself to love him. Hard as you think his heart is, it would break to lose me. At first King Minos will be angry, but he will soon forgive his only child, and by he will rejoice. I know that no more youths and maidens must come from Athens to be devoured by the Minotaur. I have saved you, Theseus, as much for my father's sake as for your own. Farewell! Heaven bless you." All this was so true and so maidenlike, and was spoken with so sweet a dignity, that Theseus would have blushed to urge her any longer. Nothing remained for him, therefore, but to bid Ariadne an affectionate farewell, and to go on board the vessel and set sail. In a few moments the white foam was boiling up from their prow as Prince Theseus and his companions sailed out of the harbour with a whistling breeze behind them. On the homeward voyage, the 14 youths and damsels were in excellent spirits, as you will easily suppose. They spent most of their time in dancing, unless when the sidelong breeze made the decks slope too much. In due season they came within sight of the coast of Attica, which was their native country. But here, I am grieved to tell you, happened a sad misfortune. You will remember, what Theseus unfortunately forgot, that his father King Aegeus had enjoined it upon him to hoist sunshiny sails instead of black ones, in case he should overcome the Minotaur and return victorious. In the joy of their success, however, and amidst the sports, dancing, and other merriment, which these young folks wore away the time, they never once thought whether their sails were black, white, or rainbow-coloured, and indeed left it entirely to the mariners whether they had any sails at all. Thus the vessel returned like a raven, with the same sable wings that had wafted her away. But poor King Aegeus, day after day, infirm as he was, had clambered to the summit of a cliff that overhung the sea, and there sat watching for Prince Theseus homeward bound. And no sooner did he behold the fatal blackness of the sails than he concluded that his dear son, whom he loved so much and felt so proud of, had been eaten by the Minotaur. He could not bear the thought of living any longer. So, first flinging his crown and sceptre into the sea, useless baubles that they were to him now, King Aegeus merely stooped forward and fell headlong over the cliff, and was drowned, poor soul, in the waves that foamed at its base. This was melancholy news for Prince Theseus, who, when he stepped ashore, found himself king of all the country, whether he would or no. And such a turn of fortune was enough to make any young man feel very much out of spirits. However, he sent for his dear mother to Athens, and by taking her advice in matters of state became a very excellent monarch, and was greatly beloved by his people. That's the end of the story, and that is one of the rather lovely illustrations in this book depicting Theseus and his mother, not long after he's picked up the stone and retrieved his sword.